My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
When President Bush was saying these words 20 years ago, on March 19, 2003, the first US aircraft were already bombing targets in Iraq. A few hours later, the ground forces of the international coalition went into action. Thus began the Second Gulf War, which was to have disastrous consequences not only for Iraq itself, but for the entire Middle East. The invasion led not only to the destruction of Saddam Hussein's regime, but above all to the destruction of Iraqi statehood. The complete collapse of public institutions and the ensuing chaos led to a bloody civil war, and the infiltration of Iraq by the neighboring Islamic Republic of Iran. The chaos in Mesopotamia was also quickly exploited by terrorists, who a few years after Saddam's overthrow raised the black flags of the Islamic State over swathes of Iraq and Syria. Iraq in a few decades went from being a regional power to a failed state. Today we look at Iraq from the perspective of 20 years after the toppling of Saddam Hussein. How has Iraq changed in the past 2 decades? Where is Iraq today? And where is it heading? Welcome to the 20s Report. Consider leaving a like if you enjoyed the video to aid the algorithm. Until the 1970s, Iraq, with a thriving economy and a strong army, was a key player in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's adventurous foreign policy, however, collapsed Iraq's potential. First, Hussein spent 8 years in a bloody war with Iran. Then he invaded Kuwait, which led to US military intervention and heavy sanctions on Iraq. Domestic perturbations also accompanied international problems. The country's economy collapsed, and Shia and Kurdish resistance to Hussein's rule began to grow. By the end of Saddam's rule, Iraq was a mere shadow of its former 1970s power. However, the real nail in the coffin for Iraq was the 2003 invasion. It not only brought the end of Saddam Hussein's rule, but also completely dismantled the Iraqi state. In May 2003, a little over a month after the fall of Baghdad, Paul Bremer, President Bush's special envoy for Iraq and head of the occupation authority, arrived in Iraq. Bremer launched a large-scale operation of de-Ba'athification of Iraq. Following the example of denazification in post-war Germany, the Americans wanted to eliminate high-ranking members of the Ba'ath Party, which had ruled Iraq since 1968, from political life. Whether someone was a subject to de-Ba'athification was determined not by the crimes they had committed, but by the mere fact of their membership of the Ba'ath Party. Bremer did not stop at destroying the Ba'ath Party. His second order, as the head of the occupation forces, was the decision to disband the Iraqi armed forces, which numbered around 300,000 troops, on the eve of the invasion. These two decisions by Bremer, the start of the de-Ba'athification and the disbanding of the Iraqi armed forces, resulted in a total of nearly 750,000 Iraqis losing their jobs overnight, with unemployment in the country rising to 60%. Bremer's colleagues warned him from the beginning about the consequences of such a repressive policy. However, Bremer remained unmoved, claiming that he was only carrying out Washington's orders. The head of the CIA cell in Baghdad, Charles Seidel, who had warned Bremer, was particularly harsh about the de-Ba'athification plans and said, quote, "If you do that, you will not be able to govern this country. By the time the sun rises over Baghdad, you will have 50,000 insurgents in the city," unquote. Time has shown that Seidel was right. The disbanding of the Iraqi army and the de-Ba'athification policy led to a rise to anti-American sentiment and gave rise to an armed insurgency against the occupation forces. The first to take arms were the Sunnis. Since the creation of the Kingdom of Iraq in 1921, they have been the political elite of the country. This was also the case under Saddam. The 2003 invasion, however, completely reversed this situation. The de-Ba'athification affected primarily the Sunnis, pushing them to the margins of political life in post-Saddam Iraq. The Sunnis' resentment towards the Americans was all the greater because after 2003, most of the power in the country went to the Kurds and Shiites. Tensions between Iraq's various ethno-religious groups have admittedly existed since the establishment of the state in 1921. Over the years, there have also been Shiite and Kurdish rebellions against the central government. Yet there have been attempts, more or less successful, to create a common Iraqi national identity. The Americans, on the other hand, led to a situation in which the political and social order was primarily based on sectarian affiliations, that is, membership of the Shiite, Sunni or Kurdish communities. As a result of US policy as early as the summer of 2003, the Sunnis who felt more embittered by the post-Saddam reality took up arms and began to organize guerrillas. The epicenter of this rebellion was in the so-called Sunni Triangle, that is the area between Ramadi, Baghdad and Tikrit. Initially, the Americans tried to portray the rebels as sympathizers of the Hussein regime. However, in the early 2004, the Mahdi army joined the rebellion. Muqtada al-Sadr, a member of a respected Shiite clan, led it. While the Sunni rebels could be accused of sympathizing with Saddam, this argument did not work in Sadr's case. After all, his father, Ayatollah Muhammad al-Sadr, like many other Shiite clerics, was killed by Saddam's men in the 1990s. Thus, less a year after Saddam's overthrow, the Americans found themselves in a situation where they had to fight both Sunnis and Shiites. Just around the corner, meanwhile, lurked another enemy, the jihadists. Advertising is what helps us do the work we do. Now a quick pause for the sponsor of today's episode, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is the world's leading family history research and DNA testing service. It has amazing features to help you find your family origins. It definitely helped me. First, I added my closest relatives, parents and grandparents. In a word, I created the first leaves of my family tree. Later, MyHeritage, with its database of over 19 billion records, using Instant Discovery's feature, started to add whole new branches to it. Thanks to this, I was able to find my relatives from as far back as the 17th century. My family tree grew from literally a few people to 229 people, most of whom I had no information about before. It was a great opportunity to preserve the memory of our ancestors, especially for my 1-year-old son. But that's not all. You can also add old photos, documents, and collect them all in one place. Later you can repair them, colorize, and even bring them to life by animating them, just like here. Sign up for 14-day free trial and enjoy all the features MyHeritage has to offer. If you'd like to continue preserving your family tree and subscribe, you will get a 50% discount with a link in the description. Quote, ISIS is another incarnation of al-Qaeda in Iraq that emerged as a result of our invasion. This is an example of unintended consequences. Therefore, in general, we should aim first and shoot later. Barack Obama, year 2015. The chaos that prevailed in Iraq after the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was quickly exploited by jihadists, the most prominent of whom was an al-Qaeda-linked Jordanian national, Abu Musab al-Zarkawi. When the Americans entered Iraq, al-Zarkawi had a small group of only about 30 fighters. The disastrous consequences of the American occupation, however, allowed al-Zarkawi to expand the ranks of his organization quickly. Al-Zarkawi deftly exploited Sunni discontent with the de-Baathification policy. He presented himself as the sole defender of the Sunnis against the Americans and the Shia-dominated government in Baghdad. Soon, al-Zarkawi became known to the whole world. In May 2004, a video of him beheading an American, Nicholas Berg, appeared online. A few months later, al-Zarkawi took an official oath of allegiance to Osama bin Laden, whom he had met a few years earlier in Afghanistan. In return, al-Zarkawi was given the title of Emir of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Zarkawi's main objective, however, was not to fight the Americans. According to Professor Fawaz Gerges, quote, from the beginning, al-Zarkawi's strategic goal was to provoke an all-out war between Shiites and Sunnis. Al-Zarkawi believed that this was the only way he could drive the Americans out of Iraq and establish an Islamic emirate here. The Jordanian national was devoid of any scruples. It was his people who popularized beheadings and suicide bombings. Al-Zarkawi's men waged total war. They attacked American soldiers, kidnapped foreigners, and organized bombings of Shiites. Attacks on Sunnis who refused to submit to al-Zarkawi were also commonplace. Al-Zarkawi's fighting methods were controversial even to other jihadists. Some of his actions, especially his attacks on Shiites, were criticized by al-Qaeda leaders Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. Yet ultimately al-Zarkawi achieved his goal and led to a bloodshed between Shiites and Sunnis. On January 22, 2006, al-Qaeda militants in Iraq detonated explosives at the al-Askari mosque in Samarra. No one was killed in the attack, but the golden dome of the mosque collapsed. This was enough to provoke Shiites into retaliatory attacks targeting Sunnis. This has plunged Iraq into two conflicts. Alongside the ongoing struggle against the occupying forces, a bloody civil war has erupted, marked by clashes between Shiites and Sunnis, bombings and ethnic cleansing. How much violence we are talking about is well illustrated by a map showing the religious ethnic changes in Baghdad in late 2006 and early 2007. The situation in Iraq had deteriorated to such an extent that by early 2007, casualties and attacks had risen to levels similar to those of the 2003 invasion. To salvage the situation, President Bush sent an additional 30,000 troops to Iraq. Despite initial criticism, the president's decision had a tangible effect. At the end of 2008, it seemed that the stabilization of Iraq was at hand. Abu Musab al-Zarkawi was killed by the Americans, which greatly weakened al-Qaeda in Iraq. Thanks to the deals made by the Americans with the tribal elders, the situation in the so-called Sunni Triangle was also brought under control. There was also success in the Shiite south. The Mahdi army was smashed, and Muqtada Sadr was forced to leave Iraq. When at the end of 2008, President Bush signed the agreement on the withdrawal of US troops from Iraq, it may have seemed that the Americans were leaving behind a relatively stable government in Baghdad. However, a new problem was already looming on the horizon. Prime Minister Maliki's authoritarian policies posed the threat of Iraq going down in flames again. Nouri Maliki became Prime Minister of Iraq in 2006. From the start, he betrayed authoritarian tendencies. As early as 2007, the US ambassador to Iraq, Ryan Crooker, described Maliki as a paranoid person who, like Hussein, was trying to accumulate as much power as possible in his hands. Maliki's authoritarian tendencies became particularly evident after 2009, when the Americans began their retreat from Iraq. In addition to his position as a prime minister, he simultaneously served as an interior minister for 4 years. He surrounded himself with loyal colleagues and broke the resistance of independent institutions. He also set up special troops that bypassed the defense ministry and answered directly to Maliki. This private army of the prime minister was referred to as Maliki's Fedaini, a reference to a similar formation that existed during the Hussein era. Maliki's men suppressed all forms of protest, especially on the streets. Under his rule, Sunnis were particularly oppressed, as Maliki, a Shia, treated them as second-class citizens. In late 2011 and early 2012, when the Americans had already withdrawn from Iraq, Maliki carried out a large-scale arrest operation among high-ranking Sunni politicians. He accused them of corruption, abuse of power, and even preparing a coup. One of the politicians for whom an arrest warrant was issued at the time was Iraq's vice president, Tariq al-Hashimi. No wonder that the rise of sectarian divisions was quickly exploited by the jihadists. Although al-Zarkawi was no longer alive, he was replaced by an equally brutal and cunning player, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who headed and reorganized al-Qaeda in Iraq, which now took the name Islamic State in Iraq. Baghdadi's men fueled the atmosphere of sectarian conflict, while gaining increasing influence in the Sunni community. The familiar Zarkawi-era motif of the jihadists as defenders of the Sunnis appeared again. It was Maliki's repressive policies that dragged many Sunnis to the side of the Islamic State. Baghdadi's ambitions were also fostered by the chaos in the neighboring Syria, which, riding the wave of Arab Spring protests, had plunged into civil war. The seizure of Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, by the jihadists became a symbol of the collapse of Maliki's policies. It was in this city that al-Baghdadi soon proclaimed the establishment of the Caliphate. As we know, after several years of fighting and the support of the international coalition, the Islamic State was defeated. However, as it happens in Iraq, the solution to one problem gave rise to another one. Years of fighting against the Islamic State have greatly strengthened Shiite militias and Iranian influence in Baghdad. As a result, Iraq has become a new field of rivalry between the US and Iran. As Mosul fell, Islamic State militants began their march on Baghdad. With the capital under threat, Ayatollah Ali Sistani, spiritual leader of the Iraqi Shiites, issued a fatwa calling on all Iraqis to stand up for their homeland. Sistani's fatwa became the basis for the establishment of the so-called People's Mobilization Force, or PMF, which included many diverse, both ethnically, religiously and ideologically, paramilitary organizations that wanted to help in the fight against ISIS. However, only one player gained the most from the creation of the PMF: Iran. The Iranians used the new formation as a platform to legitimize the existence of pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. And so, for example, one of the most powerful militias within the PMF became Kataib Hezbollah, which was formed with Iranian assistance back in 2003 to fight the US occupation forces. By joining the ranks of the PMF and thus legalizing its activities, Kataib Hezbollah rapidly increased its membership from around 2,000 as of 2010 to 10 to even 30,000 members in 2016. And the commander of Kataib Hezbollah himself, Abu Mahdi al-Muhdanis, became deputy supreme commander of the PMF. After winning the war against the Caliphate, the PMF militias were supposed to be integrated into the regular armed forces. But this has never happened. Quite simply, the pro-Iranian militias that were part of the PMF began to betray great political ambitions. In the 2018 parliamentary elections, pro-Iranian militia leaders fielded a joint list called Fatah, which means conquest in Arabic. The pro-Iranian list won 13% of the vote, the second best result. With the legalization of pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and the rise of Fatah, Iran has strengthened its already strong position on the Euphrates. The personification of Iranian influence became the figure of General Qasem Soleimani, head of the elite Quds force, part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Soleimani was a frequent visitor to Baghdad. He coordinated support for pro-Iranian militias, met with Iraqi politicians, and had an insight into everything that was happening on the Euphrates. Soleimani's position was also strengthened by the personal contacts he had with militia leaders. Muhandis, the deputy PMF chief, for example, knew Soleimani from as far back as the Iraq-Iran war. Indeed, Muhandis, like many Shiite opposition figures, had fought on the side of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iraq plays a key role in Iranian politics. It is through Baghdad that the Iranians circumvent some of the US sanctions. Iraq is also a convenient transit route for Iranian support heading to Assad in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Tehran's growing influence has made Iraq a new theater of rivalry between the US and Iran. This rivalry reached its climax in the late 2019, early 2020, when the Americans killed General Soleimani and Muhandis in Baghdad, and the Iranians fired ballistic missiles at US troops stationed at the Al-Assad base. The liquidation of General Soleimani caused chaos in the ranks of the pro-Iranian formations, but did not lead to a permanent weakening of Iran's influence in Iraq, which is still enormous. Despite appearances, Iraqi Shiites do not constitute a political monolith. In recent years, we have seen an intensification of divisions within this community. The points of contention are many, one of the most important being the attitude of Iraqi Shiites towards Iran. The pro-Iranian militias in Iraq and people like Muhandis are just a section of the Shiite community. There is also a powerful bias in the milieu centered around the aforementioned Ayatollah Sistani, who criticizes Iranian interference in Iraqi politics. This is interesting in that Sistani himself is of Iranian origin. Moreover, the conflict between the pro-Iranian militias and Ayatollah Sistani's circle has not only a political dimension, but also a religious one. Indeed, Sistani criticizes the Iranian interpretation of the idea of Wilayat al-Faqih. This is the idea that supreme power in the state should be entrusted to an Islamic scholar. This principle underpinned the Iranian political system and justified the 1979 seizure of power by Ayatollah Khomeini. Sistani rejects the Iranian model of Wilayat al-Faqih, arguing that religious leaders cannot participate directly in political processes. Contrary to appearances, this religious dispute has serious political implications. For some Iraqis believe that Tehran's ultimate goal is to export the Islamic Revolution to Iraq and remodel the country along the lines of revolutionary Iran. Another, the third Shiite party, is the group centered around Muqtada Sadr, one of the symbols of resistance against the US occupation. Sadr formerly disbanded his Mahdi army and became involved in the country's political life. His coalition won parliamentary elections in both 2018 and 2021. Sadr, especially during the occupation, has repeatedly benefited from Iranian assistance and clearly still cares about good relations with Tehran. At the same time, however, Sadr regards pro-Iranian militias as a threat to the central government and demands their dismantling. In 2022, Sadr's men even clashed with the militias in a regular battle that took place in the streets of Baghdad. Still, this is not the end of the divisions. In recent years, especially among younger Iraqi Shiites, a relatively strong movement has emerged, rejecting previous divisions and identifying neither with pro-Iranian militias nor with Ayatollah Sistani or Muqtada Sadr. They are often referred to as the so-called Tishrin movement. The name comes from Tishrin Square in Baghdad, where they organized huge protests in 2019. The Tishrin movement demands a complete overhaul of the country, disarming the militias and stripping the existing power elites. The movement is not monolithic, but it's dominated by strong nationalist and anti-Iranian voices. Although the Tishrin movement originated in Shia areas, because it rejects sectarian affiliation in favor of a common Iraqi identity, it has also won sympathy among young Sunnis. Veterans of Iraqi politics try to downplay the Tishrin movement, but demographics cannot be fooled. Iraq has one of the youngest populations in the Middle East. The median age in Iraq is around 20, and around 60% of the country's population is under the age of 25. It is estimated that the country's population will double from the current 42 million to more than 80 million by 2050. Year after year, some 500,000 Iraqis are now entering the labor market. The national economy is too small to provide employment for all of them. Unemployment among those under 30 is 3 times that of the elderly. This is the result of a weak private sector and the fact that Iraq's budget depends on oil export revenues for over 90% of its income. In a word, Iraq is a ticking demographic bomb. And as the years go by, the role of the Tishrin movement and similar, quote, protest organizations will only increase. 20 years after Saddam's fall, Iraq remains a thoroughly failed country. Years of occupation, civil war, and fighting against the caliphate have turned the country to ruin. The lack of a strong central government in Baghdad has allowed the Iranians to infiltrate the country, and the influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran to spread throughout the region. In recent years, the pace of political life has been set by growing divisions between Iraqi Shiites. These divisions are multidimensional, and the existence of well-armed militias, as a kind of state within a state, creates the risk that one of the Shiite parties will attempt to resolve the conflict by force. We already had the fourth state of such a situation last year, when Sadr's men seized the parliament building and the presidential palace and then clashed with pro-Iranian militias in Baghdad in a regular battle. The fall of Saddam Hussein offered an opportunity to create a new Iraq. However, this opportunity was missed, partly by hasty decisions taken by the US occupation authorities, and partly by conflicts among Iraqis themselves. Today, Iraq is a thoroughly failed country. With its demography and natural resources, Iraq could once again, as it did in the 1970s, become the tiger of the Middle East. The country's tragedy, however, is that Iraqis are too divided to restore the homeland to its former power. The current status quo also suits Iraq's neighbors. From the perspective of Turkey, Iran, or Saudi Arabia, it is better to maintain a weak government in Baghdad than to wake the Iraqi tiger from its slumber. Finally, thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, MyHeritage. Discover your own heritage and start recovering memories by building your family tree with a free 14-day trial and 50% discount if you decide to continue your subscription by using link in the description. Recently I had a meeting with a YouTube analyst, and she suggested that if I want the channel to grow, I should ask our audience for feedback to help boost the algorithm. So if you liked this material, please press the thumbs up button or write a comment. You may also consider supporting us on Patreon.